Okay, we're ready to go here.
Yep.
Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the June meeting of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. Nice to be out tonight, not tomorrow night. But anyway, my intro is going to be a little bit brief because I had a broken bone in my hand, in my right hand. I'm right-handed and trying to write and even go in a computer with one finger left-handed. So anyway, we normally start our meeting. We recognize we've been here for 20 years in our organization. We kind of recognize people that make all this possible.
Green button will maximize this
And
the view.
and board members. And
Okay.
start with Jeannie, board members, Jeannie Binstock, myself, Toby Chapman, Audrey Glickman, Jim Hamden, who's co-president, Tony Indovina, who's doing our presentation tonight, Vice President Helen Wilson, Evelyn Young, Todd Miller, who's our programming coordinator, and Stanley Klein, who's our membership coordinator. I'd like to thank all those people for the contributions they make. We have upcoming events scheduled through July, through September, actually. July, we have Eric Lidgy, excuse me if I pronounce it wrong, doing the family clubs of Squirrel Hill. We're talking family. He's the director of the Squirrel History Program and Archives at the Heinz History Center. September, we have Jake Way Carter, who's president of the Greater Hazelwood Historical Society. Will present an overview of this Hazelwood history. In October, Lawrenceville Historical Society will present a presentation regarding the Allegheny Arsenal. Keeping it brief, tonight's program will be presented by Tony Indovina, and it'll be regarding the Friends of the Neill Log House, and they'll be doing a presentation of the log house. So right now, let me just turn it over to Tony. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. Those of you on the extended mailing list, I get email from someone who calls himself the History Squirrel. That would be me, Tony Indovina, your email coordinator. But I'm changing hats tonight and speaking to you as the president of Friends of Neill Log House. I have some wonderful slides that I want to get through, and I'm going to mention everybody in our organization and a little bit about how we came to be, and certainly save time for a few of our board members who are here to present. First of all, I want to acknowledge this beautiful new logo we have, and I will introduce our artist in a moment. But I'd like to do a little personal aside. What you're looking at is, sorry, do we have a technical question? Okay. What we're looking at is one of Helen Wilson's. Helen Wilson is our historian for the Historical Society, her Then and Now series. Above is a detail from that beautiful mural in the Squirrel Hill Post Office. And below is the same view that I get from across the street where I live on Beechwood Boulevard. This has been my home for more than 30 years. And the point I want to make is I've developed a much deeper appreciation for my neighborhood in my part of South Squirrel Hill by learning about some of the early history of it. Less than 100 yards from where I can stand above my neighbor's yard and see this view is where William Killymoon Stewart had his tavern and stagecoach stop in the tract of land he called Viewland. Now, having said that, I want to ask the question, what difference does it make if we really save a log house that is in very decayed and deteriorated condition. It's on the edge of a golf course and has been locked up for 30 years. And my argument for this would be, we would lose the history of this house and all the stories that we can come to learn about it. It's a wonderful opportunity we have, and I'll explain how we all got involved in this. It all started for us in August of 2020, when I was notified through email that we had been invited to nominate the Neill Log House for this website. It's called the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail Experience. This was being developed for the National Park Service to parallel the Lewis and Clark Historic Trail. And the purpose of this site is geotourism, to really encourage people to do and see things along the trail. And here we are in Pittsburgh. This is the portion of the interactive map. Pittsburgh is the easternmost point of the Lewis and Clark Trail, where Meriwether Lewis launched his historic journey, starting at the point in 1804, his keelboat west. What you see here, I'll speak to all these blue dots you see, but at the time that we were nominated, the red dot is the Neill Log House. We were one of only 3 locations identified on this interactive map, along with the Fort Pitt Museum and the Heinz History Center. When you click on the red, you're taken to the article that I wrote in October of 2020, where I really piggybacked on the research provided for us by the National Park Service about the possible connection of Meriwether Lewis to the Neill Log House. And I wrote about the possibility that because he'd been to Pittsburgh before, he was a volunteer, Virginia volunteer in the Whiskey Rebellion, he would have known his way on the Nemacolin Trail to Braddock. And then we speculated that he could have taken old stagecoach routes and wagon routes through Squirrel Hill overland to avoid the muddy river bottom, passing by the Neill Log House on his way to the point. So this is what started it all. And in that same newsletter, I'd like to point out the October 2020 newsletter, Helen Wilson wrote a very definitive article about the story of the Neill Log House. So that's there for your reference too. So at that point, things started moving very quickly. We started visiting the site. We knew, or thought we knew, that it was owned by the city of Pittsburgh, but we didn't know who to contact. There were members of the Historical Society who really wanted to get inside and really talk to them about whether we could possibly remove that gate and talk about exposing this to the public again. After a number of attempts, we were able to get through with the director of the Department of Public Works and his assistant and get permission to enter the house. Which we did. And these are several pictures from our first visit. Prepare yourself. This is the shocking view you get when you walk inside the Neill Log House, and I'm afraid it looks pretty much the same. The place has been locked up, unused for over 30 years. The artifacts that I'll talk about, some of which you'll see, are in the condition that they are. And we are in the early stages of working with the conservator to assess exactly what is worth saving from when this was open to the public over 30 years ago. But basically, everything there is lived with large and small mammals and families of fox. And then here's our co-president, Wayne Bossinger, braving those back steps to go up to the loft. There's a sign upstairs that says no more than 3 people. You don't want 3 people upstairs. Okay. This all led to December of 2020, and our handsome Charlie Stewart looks the same with a mask there as he does tonight. One of our longtime members identified himself as the 4th great-grandson of Robert Neill and offered to help and get involved in this, which he certainly has. Alongside him there is his daughter Natalie Stewart, who is the artist who did the logo and some of the artwork you'll see later. But the important thing about this day, and I'm sorry to say this is the only photograph we have of this historic day, he had made arrangements for us to have an inspection done by a very well-known historic preservationist, a man who was known as the architect of Fort Ligonier, Brad Mooney. At Charlie's request, we contracted with him to come and do a physical inspection of the log house, which he did. I'm sorry to say that shortly after this inspection, Brad developed a serious condition and passed away several months later. So we no longer have him with us, but he shared with us his findings from that day. And basically it was that the house is unsafe to use unless stabilized, and several major elements of reconstruction done. So since that time, we've had a number of inspections, and what you're seeing here, this is actually Dave Schofield, who's holding the red toolkit. Dave is on our board, and I'll talk about him later, but this was from the very recent dendrochronology test that was conducted to scientifically date the log house. We're very fortunate to have an individual on our board, a retired architect and historic preservationist himself, Al Schmidlap. He is on the building and design committee that you'll hear about shortly. And he conducted an inspection for the log house for the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy in 2014. And what he was able to do was really look at all Brad's findings and agree that indeed they were the same as the conditions that he noted, with the work that he indicated would have to be done, only deteriorated with time. Okay. Okay, back to that interactive slide from the National Historic Trail Experience site. All the blue dots you see are additional sites that were nominated for inclusion on the site by our friends at the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition. It was Marty Eisler, the president of Shook, and her executive director, Maria Cohen, who did all this work to identify, as the site asks you to do, places to see and visit, eat and stay, historic, educational, recreational places to visit as you travel the Lewis and Park Trail. And thanks to their efforts, the Pittsburgh site is one of the richest along the whole trail right now in terms of information available. Every one of those is interactive. Everyone takes you to the work that they did to identify something worth seeing in Pittsburgh. But that began a collaboration between our two associations, one that led us to where we are, because it was a couple members of Shook and several members of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society who became the core of the executive committee for our new organization. I will show you here a simplified version of our board. We are a board of 12 right now. The executive committee, as I said, the officers are formed by members of our founding organizations. And then we had to scratch our heads and decide who was going to be president, and I won. But one of our first challenges was to really try to have a representative cross-section of people who could really contribute something to this effort. And we did this by appealing to the CEOs and presidents of all the major historic and preservation societies in Pittsburgh and asking them to nominate someone who would sit on our board, and they did. And we call those individuals our dream team, and we are extremely fortunate to have the talent and dedication of all these individuals. I'm going to mention, in the course of my talk, I'll mention a number of our board members, and right now I'm going to mention everyone who won't be mentioned later on. Just to tell you that we did become incorporated in October of 21. We formed under bylaws. The bylaws specify representation from our founding organizations, the Historical Society and Shook, and also the city, and also the family. We include make provision for a descendant of the family of Robert Neill, and that's Charlie's role as our treasurer. But then we also have our organizational representatives and at-large representatives. So we make room for all the talent that we feel can contribute. We actually are a couple seats below our capacity. Some individuals who aren't mentioned later on, I'd like to single out right now in particular. The woman who's worked with us from the beginning, from the city, the Department of Public Works, Claire Mastro Berardino, is the senior project manager of the city architectural division. She's an extremely talented and dedicated individual who's very patiently worked with us to negotiate some very rough terrain as far as city rules and regulations. So we're very thankful for having her on our team. The only CEO and president we have sitting on our board is Catherine Qureshi from the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. She has graciously agreed to sit in on our meetings and hold that place while they're going through some staff changes. People not on the board who are very strong members of our team, of course, Maria Cohen, our executive director from Shook, and her assistant, Sophie Bean. And then we have a couple of members who choose to serve in committee capacities because they feel they can contribute more that way. That's our chief historian and vice president, Helen Wilson, who works a lot on committees, and the president emeritus of Preservation Pittsburgh, Melissa McSwigan, who does a lot of work for us and with Marty, as you'll hear later, in fundraising. Okay, this was another gathering at the Log House, and we have to be very discriminating as to why we go in there. This is probably the largest group we sent into the Log House. Masks are recommended, not just for COVID. It's a very dusty environment. But this occurred in March of 21 to work with one of our, Don Mudrick is another individual not on our board, who's Claire's assistant, and he let us in that day. He provides a lot of on-site help as well as help at meetings, but he joined with some of our members to try to do a physical inventory of all the artifacts that have been in there unused and uncared for over the years. There's a sampling of these right here, just very quickly, just a few. Later on, we were able to acquire an actual copy, an artifact copy of the inventory and list of donation from the Junior League of Pittsburgh, who actually donated most of the items that are in the Log House, along with the value and where they came from. So this, along with another inventory that occurred near the end of when the Log House, we believe, was open for public usage in 1990, were the foundation for us trying to sort out exactly what is there. And then with the help of conservators, try to decide what of value can be salvaged. What I'm showing you here, much of my work, besides just working on setting up agendas and attending all committee meetings, is really to try to stay on top of the history and the kind of narrative that we want to deliver to our publics, whether that's grant applications, presentations like this, or brochures that we'll develop for activities that we're involved in. I call it the working copy of the brief history of the Neill Log House. We try to keep it brief. This would be the kind of information that we'll post on park signage that I'll talk about in a minute. What you see in red is the large edit that I'm in the process of making since we discovered that we were considerably off with the actual date that the log house was built. It has been definitively nailed down to 1795 through scientific means that we'll talk about. But some of the other information that is included in this narrative is the fact that it is the oldest domestic structure in the city, and we have to revise that somewhat and say log house structure, because it is one of several other 18th century structures. And we're talking about the Woods House and the Frew House as stone houses that are older than the Neill Log House. that it's a very distinguished example of early frontier vernacular architecture. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And maybe most important for grant purposes, that it was a contributing factor, a major contributing factor to Shenley Parks being designated a National Historic District. The log house itself has city historic designation, but it was a major contributor to the National Historic Site designation for the park. This is the current signage. If you've gone to the log house, you won't see this sign. It's actually in the woods below the Bartlett Street playground. It's actually on the back side of another city sign that you wouldn't even notice if you were walking by it. And really, the information is very dated. I'm not sure exactly when it got installed there. But we have gotten permission from city, from Claire and the city to create a new sign, prettier than the copy here, but the copy has been agreed to, and it will be on visually nice, standard. I like it because it's a timed format that will be much more interesting. It's also going to have, to appeal to young people more, it's going to have a QR code so we can let people just, if they're quickly passing by, take a picture and then get back to the history that we want to share with them on our website. And it's going to be located at the base of the log house. We're going to agree to an exact location. It's going to be close to the monument, the Katakahasa Fountain Monument that's still there. And what you're looking at are old postcards of that site. On the left is the monument looks the same, but it looks very different. The path isn't there for this picture. To the right, you'll see that the monument covers Snyder Spring. Snyder Spring was the historic place where Meriwether Lewis could have stopped to water his horses. That's what it was. That's all capped off right now. And I should mention that Friends of Neill Log House will not have any responsibility for the Katakahasa Fountain Monument or the steps. So we'll work that out with the city, but it's historically part of the same site. So a lot of what we know about the Neill Log House is from old and newer photographs, images, documents. Here's a photograph of the log house from 1969, immediately prior to when it was scheduled for reconstruction. Well, it was scheduled for restoration, but the collapse caused it to be a reconstruction. So what we can say properly is that the Neill Log House is a reconstruction around original fireplace and chimney. I want you to take note, little device here, that little peak right there, you'll see it again in a moment. This is a beautiful picture of that beautiful two-hearth fireplace inside the log house. And that log figures prominently in dating the house. The lintel piece built into the fireplace is one of only two original pieces of wood determined to be in the log house. We have a series of pictures from that 1969, 1970 reconstruction. Here's the fireplace with the two hearths, the front one being for cooking, the side one being for heating. And note that because when you look at the log house today, from the side of the log house where the chimney is, there's just a portion of stone that shows. Most of the fireplace is physically within the log house, which meant that it was heated very efficiently, okay, the way it was designed. It really was a very distinctive building that was constructed. There's several other pictures of the work that went on during that reconstruction. And none of the logs we've determined that got put back are original to the log house. And there you see some in the final stages of putting it back together again. So these 24 photographs that we have are some of over a couple hundred that are on file at Pittsburgh History and Landmarks, where we got these, that hopefully our building and design committee hopes to have scanned and see to maybe pick out details that will guide us in our restoration work. Now, I said the word restoration because our project, we hope, will be restoring the Neill Log House to 1970 standards. So when it fell to the ground, it was reconstructed we hope to restore it to 1970 conditions. This is a base page inside the cover of a 1936 landmark work on architecture by the gentleman who was the architect for the 1969-70 reconstruction, Charles Morris Stoltz. He was a renowned architect and preservationist of his era, who, as you can see, years before he was involved in working with Pittsburgh History and Landmarks for the reconstruction, was involved in surveying historic architecture in Western Pennsylvania. Several years before he wrote this landmark book, he was the county agent for a National Park Service project called the Historic American Building Survey, HABS. I have to get that right. Okay, I will refer to it as HABS. And what's really important about his involvement in both of these projects is earlier and then through this landmark book, he really points out that the Neill Log House is a very singular example, one of the most interesting examples of a log house in Western Pennsylvania. And I will talk a little bit about the distinction between a log house and a log cabin. Here's a plate from that book that hands down is probably my favorite image of the log house. It's dated C 1900. We know nothing about the family or individuals who are shown. We do know what the chain of ownership was from 1795, when we have records that Robert Neill sold the house and property, up until it was purchased by the last owner, that was Colonel James O'Hara, the grandfather of Mary Shenley. We believe that none of the owners actually lived in the log house. We believe that it was rented by tenants like these who just worked off the land the best they could, and it had to be a hard existence. It had to be hard for Robert Neill, the wife and 5 daughters living in 1.5 rooms. Okay. So tenants like these likely occupied the log house right up until the golf course issue. When would that have been, Charlie? 1902, something like that?
The golf course was about 1910.
Okay, so anytime up until then, we could have had tenant families like this. I would refer you to an article in June.
The city took it over in 1910. The Pittsburgh Golf Club built it around 1900.
Okay, about 1900. Okay. I would refer you to a beautiful little article in our June newsletter of the Historical Society, the contribution by Brian Hunter about his family's genealogy, and one of his ancestors, Mary, who had related her oral history experiences of living on that hill in log houses and knowing of the Neill Log House. I was also kind of tickled to realize that when Killy Moon, the guy who owned the property my house is on Beechwood Boulevard, when his granddaughter, Elizabeth Stewart, acquired the property, she married into the Birchfield family, and the Birchfields were one of the early tenants of the Neill Log House too. So there's just much, much more history that we have to learn about it. This is the HABS, the Historic American Building Survey project today. It exists in digital form through the Library of Congress. Many of the images, photos, drawings, source documentation that we have archived, we've drawn off this site. Here's one of the oldest photographs of the log house. And for a long time, if you remember the picture I just showed of the collapsed house, there was a peak in the back. For a time, a long time, there was a shed on what we know as the back of the log house facing the golf course, which was actually the front entrance to the log house, apparently, because, well, let's skip over. Another primary source that came out of that HABS project was the Wardy map from the original owner, Ambrose Newton, who acquired it while stationed at Fort Pitt, 1769. Okay. An early drawing from the 20th century that we believe may be attributed to Charles Stultz. And this is what I wanted to show you. This is an old postcard, and there are postcards that will show no doors. We have another postcard besides this that has no doors or windows facing from Circuit Drive. If you were standing at the bottom of the steps where Katakahatsa Fountain is, that is the view you get. So there's a lot more that we don't know about the history and changes to it than we do. But what I'm pointing out to you, one of the features, all right, the distinction between a log house and a log cabin. Stultz, in his historic designation for the log house, pointed to it as a very distinctive architectural form in the early frontier. It was a time, log house is something that, it means something culturally and architecturally. Culturally, it means it was a time when people were building structures like this to stay. They weren't intending to move again. They weren't log cabins that they were only going to live in a few years. They were meant to be permanent structures. And there are a number of architectural features that go along with that. The one that I'm pointing out to you here is glass windows. Log cabins did not have glass windows. It's likely that the log house, our log house, did not have glass windows when it was built in 1795, but Colonel James O'Hara actually started a glass manufacturing company that made window glass in 1797. So it's very likely that very early on, the log house was one of the first structures to have window glass. One of the artifacts we've required, one of the many artifacts, came from Pittsburgh History and Landmark Foundation, and one of our board members is Bob Juka, who's a docent for PHLF. This is one of our recent acquisitions showing a tour guide training manual from 1985. So we believe the log house was open to the public. We believe through the junior league, there's actually a portion of this 30-some page manual that has directions for docents and instructions for the junior league to open it for the public. But we don't have any details of the actual, except through newspapers and some oral history stories. We don't have any hardcore details about the actual usage of the log house. We believe it was open up until the early 90s. So all the information, what you're looking at is a screenshot of a Google Doc. Maria and her assistant managed this through the Urban Coalition. It's got many folders of information for all the administrative work that is necessary for our board and committees. And there's also a History Neill Log House folder that has subfolders and subfolders of all the various things, some of which I've shown you, and many, many more. It's become a little hard to negotiate. Marty and Maria are actually going to be supervising an intern from Chatham University starting next month, whose job it will be to really kind of organize this into a more coherent fashion so that when we want to lay our fingers on a source of information for a particular narrative, particular use, we'll be able to do it. Newspaper sources, we're really in need of volunteers who maybe have access to the Post-Gazette archive, who have some expertise in extracting information. We would really like to more comprehensively comb the late 19th century, early 20th century to learn more than we can. This is an article from 1972. Okay, which would have been about the earliest time that it was open for public use. So there was some kind of programming going on in there sponsored by the Junior League. Newspaper sources, primary sources are very much needed. to really kind of document a lot of the oral history that we know. There are a lot of stories, a lot of oral history, but a lot that needs to be substantiated through primary sources. So that's going to be our challenge going forward. And this would come from tax records, genealogy, files, other sources like that. What I'm showing you here is the interrelationship between our committees. And our two committees that you hear about tonight, building and grounds and funding, are fully operational, a wonderful, dedicated, talented staff meeting monthly, feeding into our board meetings. The third ring is usage, which is our ultimate goal. It is what everything is leading to. I really believe the future of after reconstruction, restoration, being able to open the place to the public is going to come through the kind of collaborations that we've started to build with Chatham University, that we hope to form with other area universities, educational programming. And some of the areas you see are some of the many contributing activities that are going on. And there are more than what you see there, but I'll just show you a couple. This is the dendrochronology effort that we recently completed, and Dave Schofield, the director of Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and Historic Village, our board member and member of our Building and Grounds Committee, was instrumental in suggesting that this would be a way to once and for all scientifically date the log house. That was done through that lintel that you saw in the fireplace, and miraculously somehow someone saved a piece of the original front door, which we found up in the loft. So after a thorough examination of the log houses that exist today, there were only two original pieces of wood. The core samples through this program really live, and that's quite an article. If you didn't happen to read it, I would strongly encourage you to learn about the history of dating structures historically through science. The other activity that Marty will speak to is a major fundraiser that we have coming up in the fall. One of our members, Carolyn Boyce, this is a screenshot of an article that exists on our house history page. You can go on our website and see this today, and it's called My Happenstance with Henry Kerner. If you know Neill Hill, you might recognize those little statues, the putti, okay?
And the front, is the front door still Negri Avenue? Glass.
There's the front door with the
That I
stained
would
glass
have my
window.
young children look at.
Yes. But you can read about that in her story. So I would encourage you to go online and do that. But what I want to share with you is you'll be hearing a lot of information over the next couple of months about this fall event, which will benefit the Neill Log House. She's actually borrowing a lot of originals of Henry Kerner. And the whole purpose of this, through 3 days of activities, will be to rediscover the legacy of a world-class artist who lived and worked right here on Neill Hill and Squirrel Hill. It's a wonderful story. There's smaller grants that Marty will be pursuing, both to restore the artifacts that are worth restoring in the house, and also to perhaps revive a period garden. Like, we're not sure how far they got in this. This was an original plan from 1970 something. We believe that this materialized in some form, but Marty is looking to this as a phase to follow the actual physical reconstruction of the log house. And lastly, I'd like to recognize some other board members who are also Squirrel Hill Historical Society members. Charlie Stewart, of course, I recognized. I would also like to thank him, besides being very much involved in everything we do. He was the first to make a considerable personal financial contribution toward the whole project. Ray Baum, who could not be here tonight, he's the current secretary of Shook and a past president. He's also an indispensable member to us in all matters relating to legal work. He helped us put our papers of incorporation together, our bylaws, and he works with us through some very tricky government relations negotiations. And last would be someone who's leaving us. We have our first departure from the board, another Historical Society member, Melanie Como Harris, who's an architectural associate project manager with ICM Architecture. She's leaving the state and sadly will be leaving Lori's committee. She worked very closely with Lori in Building and Grounds. I'd like to bring Lori up here next. She will speak about the Building and Design Committee. Lori is an architect and project manager of Boswick Design Partnership. The backdrop of the slide I showed you a moment ago shows one of the many flow charts that Lori has developed. And what you're looking at is the way she's trying to train the rest of us to think, okay? In each of our various endeavors, for example, if we're working on a fundraiser for the fall, she's going to guide us through a process called pool planning, where we start at the end, consider what it is we want to accomplish, and then work backwards and decide what all has to be done and by when. And hopefully it looks something like what Lori's done. But she likes to refer to her work of her committee as like preparing for a birthday party. They do all the hard work, and the rest of us are looking forward to eating cake and ice cream and making presents. Okay, that's basically all we do. And then following her will be my VP, the current president of Shook, Marty Eisler. And I'll simply say that without her mentorship and friendship, I would not be able to assume the responsibilities I have. And also without her considerable expertise. With that, we're going to look forward to a lot, I think, in terms of fundraising. So Lori, if you'd like to come up first, and then all of us can be available for questions and answers. Okay.
So I'm Lori Fitzgerald. So I'm an architect. I'm the director of Boswick Design Partnership, which is an architecture firm based out of Cleveland, offices here in Pittsburgh. I'm the practice leader for community projects. I'm a Squirrel Hill resident, and I'm on the board of the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition as well. So joined the Friends of Neill Log House in my role as Urban Coalition board member. So I have worked on a number of projects throughout the city that are historic or adaptive reuse. I've only ever touched one log house in the past at the Pittsburgh Botanic Garden, but have an interest in kind of early American history anyway. And I live very near Squirrel Hill or Shenley Park and walk in Shenley Park all the time. So this sort of just naturally aligned with kind of my personal interests and experience. And like Tony said, I'm trying to guide the Building and Grounds Committee through a focused look at how do we prepare this building to be suitable, legal, and ready for use for the intended educational purposes and all of the other kind of good stuff that's happening. So we're kind of looking at it in a more narrow focus of just how do we make the building get ready. We're not looking at the artifacts. We're not looking even at the moment at the landscape. We're not looking so much at the history or the educational things. We're just kind of looking at the building itself. So on our committee, like Tony said, we have Melanie Como Harris, who's about to depart. She's also an architect. Ella Schmidluck, who's a preservation architect. David Schofield, who's the executive director for Meadowcroft, the historic site, archaeological site. And then a number of the other board members are supporting our committee. So Tony already went through a lot of the history here. We've been looking specifically, how do we define what the building needs, particularly to be able to be stable, structurally sound, safe for the public to enter, all of that. And how do we describe that enough so that someone could give us prices for that, so we could raise the appropriate funds for that, so we could kind of accomplish all that. And how long is that going to take? So what I've been doing with the committee is describing the scope of work. So we go back to the birthday party idea. If I said to the whole room, like, we're going to have a birthday party, we'd all have very different ideas of what that is. And if we were, hosting our own birthday parties, we could do that however we want. This is public property, so we can't just do whatever we want, right? We have to kind of get consensus about what it is that we're going to do, how are we going to do it, very particularly describe that, and have a clear description so that someone else can build it, right? I'm not gonna do the construction work. We have to be able to describe it to people that are doing it. So we've gone through and we've prioritized a number of the items that need to be accomplished to to get to a point of frankly having a building or a occupancy permit. We need a building permit through the city to do this. There are a number of review processes that have to happen at the city as well, again, because it's public property and to go through art commission, historic review commission, and it's, you know, it's complicated because it's on the golf course and the parks, and a lot of those elements require their own review processes. So we've gone through the scope of work, we've gone through architectural scope of work. So we're taking photographs and just started to note in a kind of a rough way, you know, what pieces need to be repaired, right? So we need to reframe the door, we need to repair the window, the ground, the sill logs at the lower level have sustained the most damage. Obviously, they're in contact with rain and snow and animals and lawnmowers, and so that's also where most of the settling has occurred. So we're proposing to replace certain logs, not to rebuild the whole thing. Gone through each side of the building, described that, as well as on the north side. There's we're planning a little bit of site work there to prevent some future water damage. When we get this kind of settled, we're gonna, at our next meeting, actually, we're gonna start to zoom out a little bit and think about what the site around this could start to be. We'll start to think about how do we provide access for wheelchairs or strollers, how do we make space for appropriate gardens or trees, kind of just like start to think about the landscape. At the moment, we are really just thinking about the house, and we're really focusing our efforts on the immediate vicinity. So yeah, as I just said, the next phase will be to zoom out and think about the landscape. And I think that was the end of my part, right? Okay. Yes,
I'm gonna assume there's no foundation.
there is a foundation. Yeah, so it's not really clear from the photos. So as Tony explained, the house collapsed. It was rebuilt in 1969. At that point, it was rebuilt as faithfully as they knew how to kind of 1795 standards. It was kind of the infancy of preservation as a kind of effort in architectural world. But they did a really good job of restoring it at that time, rebuilding it at that time. It's not clear to me, I don't think that we know from Ellis or David, if the foundation was significantly rebuilt then. Certainly all the log structure was.
Well, we have all the pictures that we'll be looking at.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of photos that show a foundation being rebuilt. So it's possible the foundation was more or less intact, or maybe it was repaired, and that the log structure was just rebuilt on top of that. But there is a foundation, so it's sort of a short crawl space below.
I mean, if you want to have people inside, it has to be sturdy.
Yeah, so so that's one of the things is some of the repair work that we're proposing is the floorboards and the floor
I
structure.
live very close by, was to pass it every day,
Yeah,
and it was always closed. I never saw a soul. I thought it was just there for show.
it is right now. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've only gained
From
access
the
through the city
60s on.
for these particular visits to make the assessments. But the goal would be that it'll be open to the public for educational purposes, not every day, not 24/7, you know, certain times, but safe so that someone can walk in. I mean, it's safe. It's safe. It's
We're insured.
we have stood on the floor. We have stood on the floor and we're all here.
Okay.
And but we want to make sure that it's really safe for the public. Yeah, so Marty's going to talk about how do we pay for it all.
There's a question.
Oh, yeah, question, yeah.
Speak up.
Go ahead. No, I'll follow.
Are there any plans to do an archaeological dig?
Could we hold off on the questions for a
Oh, yeah.
moment until Marty
I'll be
finishes?
quick, so that you can ask the architect all the technical questions. We have a 5-year fundraising goal of $700,000, which would take us to 27. And the reason is that we're going to need staffing to keep the facility open, which we're estimating will cost us about $50,000 a year. Not open every day, as Lori said, but open approximately 80 to 100 days a year, so that we could be open in the summer, we could be open for school projects, we could be open for special events, but not open all the time every day, because we just don't have the ability, nor will we be able to raise the funding to do that. But the restoration of the log house, we've had estimates between $200,000 and $250,000 to completely make it stable, replace the floor, replace the roof, do everything that Lori talked about and had circled in red. We're using the higher figure just in case we don't have a figure yet, but we will revise this when that happens. We're looking at the storage of interior furnishings, and again, Charlie Stewart has arranged for Guardian, a man named Mr. Cohen, who has been kindly offered a place for us to store the artifacts if we can get them there. And as Tony noted, the artifacts are in terrible shape. So what we might need is more money to restore them or replace them, because we've been informed that some of them are not worth restoring. They're in such bad condition. It'll be actually less expensive for us to purchase new ones, find them, period artifacts. The restoration we have listed as $10,000. That could go up because of the condition that we're finding. Handicap accessibility will probably come from the maintenance building that's sort of behind the golf course. If you think about where the log house is, coming in from the back, because those steps, if you've ever tried to walk them, they don't even have a railing on the first part of the steps, and they're quite steep and difficult to manage. So we can't imagine anything switchback that would get you up to the house, because it would just take so much property. The establishment of the period garden, we're looking at about $50,000. There was an estimate of $30,000 all those years ago in the 70s, and that was just for the garden, not for trees. So we've used that. The property maintenance, we're looking at the city helping us with cutting the grass. And I should mention that we have an agreement with the city that is signed to give us access. But it also informs the parameters of a lease that we will be negotiating long-term, so that we'll be able to, for 19 years or 29 years, or however long the city decides, that we'll be able to basically have access to that, the way Phipps has access to their property, the way the zoo has access. It'll be that kind of a lease negotiation, so that we will be fully in charge of everything that happens at the Neill Log House. Property maintenance, staff, we're going to be, hopefully, if there are any logs that need to be replaced or anything that will be redone in the period at the way it was done in circa 1795, we'll be having students, history students. We already know there are history students from Chatham who are interested in seeing that kind of restoration or reconstruction, as Tony calls it. The educational program development, we want to have the docent scripts. We'd like to have a K through 12 curriculum that can match the PA standards for history curriculum, so that each grade level, K, 1, 2, all the way up to 12, would have some part of the history and the significance of the Neill Log House within the context of the history curriculum. And then the public opening, office staff, and education staff, we're looking at about $50,000 a year. Now, you realize this is a budget, and it's a long-term budget. It's estimated. We're learning more every day, and we will be revising it as we put out the case for support. As Tony mentioned, Charlie has very generously given us the funding that would enable us to be able to file the articles of incorporation and pay for administrative costs that we have, and some other, the dendrology and things that we had immediately. We also had a family foundation contribute $25,000. So we are in good stead in terms of keeping us going while we do the significant fundraising. We were turned down from the Keystone Fund for a $100,000 grant. We are working with Senator Costa to figure out how to get that $100,000 from some other possible state government site. We have been invited to submit to a number of foundations that we'll hear about this summer, one in August and one in September. So we believe, and of course I'm a cockeyed optimist, if anybody who knows me, but we believe there is a good chance that there are a number of foundations and individual philanthropy out there that will want to help support this effort, because it is so significant in terms of the history of our region. It was Pittsburgh before Pittsburgh was even incorporated. And it tells a story, as Tony said, can you imagine living in that house with 5 daughters? And I can't even imagine. But it does tell a story. We talked to Chatham already about the possibility of the interactive and the multimedia kinds of experiences that you can have to tell, for example, that may never be handicap accessibility in the sense of someone with a wheelchair going into the facility. But we may be able to give that same experience through the multimedia, the Chatham, the interactive, the multimedia. So we're looking at everything. We're learning every day. My son tells me that it keeps my mind from turning to mush because I have to keep up with everything that these people are trying to teach me so I can incorporate it into our request for money. But if you have questions for Lori or for any of us, please feel free. Thank you.
I'd like to remind everyone that we're working on our 501c3 paperwork, but we are.
We're the fiduciary.
Right. We have a fiduciary arrangement with the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition. Everything donated to the Friends of the Log House is tax deductible through them. So, your questions, please.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Have you approached Heinz History Center for funds? I would think this was something that they would be interested in.
Well, they're very much a part of, they're part
They're
of
on
our
the
board.
board.
Yeah,
They are.
yes.
I've had some experience with old houses, and over the years, all kinds of stuff is deposited around the house and gets buried. You know, it's a matter of having a metal detector or something, but I haven't heard any comment on that. Has that been done around the Neill House? And what
Well,
have they found? Because there's always stuff there.
okay, during the 1969-70 reconstruction, there were a number of artifacts that were uncovered when the site was completely opened up. There's a number on that, Helen. I can't recall how many it is, but those are in the possession of Carnegie Institute from 1969-70. So to answer your question, there was a deliberate effort to get everything that was on site before they reconstructed the building.
And I-
We have yet to contact them about that, but that should be on our list.
The other concern I had, that chain link fence is terrible.
Yes, we agree. So
We
again,
hate that.
like,
Yeah.
so again, it was just to keep our efforts focused, we're focused just on the building right now, like literally like a foot outside the building, and then we're gonna zoom out and talk about the other aspects, but because the building right now is not stable and is at risk of getting worse, we want to focus on getting that fixed first, and then we'll start to think about improving the site.
But what, I have a concern about vandalism. That sits up there, and how do you protect it? And
Yeah,
I don't
we-
have
we-
an answer.
We don't know yet. We have to brainstorm about how to best protect it. I imagine there will be a fence. It probably, I hope it will be much better than the fence that's there.
Yeah.
But something to protect it from
Now,
vandalism.
there has been agreement by our city reps who we worked with, that there is some final treatment that should be more appropriate than that cyclone
Yes,
fence.
yes.
But security is going to be an issue.
Yeah.
So far, the biggest problem we have is it gets dinged by golf balls a lot. But the animals, you can't
Animals,
keep the animals.
yeah.
A couple of those pictures, it looked to me like it had a metal roof,
No, it's
but
a wood.
was it always shakes?
It would have, yeah, there, I mean, they wouldn't have had access to anything.
I'm just
fabric.
looking at the pictures, yeah.
Right, so we're gonna replace it with an oak, ribbon oak shingle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so shake roof. Yeah.
It's been treated various ways over the years. I think what you were picking on in some of the old postcards for a
there-
time, there
that's
was some,
right.
there
There
was some
was-
vertical planking that looks like metal.
It
That's
actually
what I
may
was
have
noticing,
been
yeah.
metal at some point, but you know, originally in 1795, obviously wouldn't fit. So anything we're doing, we're trying to be as kind of faithful to an original as we could be and not incorporating metal elements.
Yes.
Have you included any contingency or inflation escalators in these estimates?
Well, we did have we included any inflation? Yes, because when we had some costs, for example, of the garden, we knew that you couldn't do that for $30,000 in this day and age. So we did up that figure. But as I said, as we get real estimates from real contractors and people who are going to be actually doing the work or bidding on the work, giving us quotes for the work, we will be changing that. And we will be mindful of the fact that this is now
I just
2022.
wondered if you put a contingency in there. I mean, 20% would be normal.
Well, the detail of the scope of work that Lori's committee did has that contingency in it. So that's reflected in the top line.
Which again is, so that's kind of us, like if we go back to the birthday party example, that's kind of us saying, okay, we should set aside, $50 for a cake. But we go to the bakery, we find out the actual price, like, right, there, and maybe we're off, we're lower or we're higher, but we won't really, we're gonna adjust these as we get better information. But you're right, that's also like saying, you know what, we should keep $100 in reserve for
Yeah.
like something going wrong, so.
And if I could just say a fun fact to know and tell, for our case for support, we're getting quotes from our previous mayors and our current mayor. We have them from Luke Ravenstall, Tom Murphy, and Bill Pedugo, and the request is out to get it from our current mayor, Gainey, and they're all very supportive of what we're trying to do. Obviously, they should be Swan City property, but Tom Murphy, 50 years ago, started rebuilding log cabins on his farm in Zelienople. And he has rebuilt, with the help of Amish, 2 of them. One is a 1760 and the other one is an 1810. And they are very similar to what we're looking at. And he's very interested in what we're doing. He's given us tours of his facility. And it's just funny how the thought of fixing this one house has spread us out into so many other stories.
You had a question. I'm curious what your question.
Mine was just about the archaeological work underneath the floors. If you're going to replace the floors, you might as well look, because I'm not sure what the standards were for the 1960. Work.
Okay, the floor was completely removed. As I said, there was a deliberate excavation to retrieve any artifacts that were there. There are some reports on that. We know that a certain number of pieces were removed and are in possession of Carnegie Institute. We don't know what those are, but we know that they're in safekeeping.
And right now, we actually don't anticipate that we'll have to replace the entire floor right now, so we don't expect that we're going to be disturbing the earth in this first stage of just the housework very much, if at all. A little bit on the north side to help with some drainage so that it doesn't damage the house. As we zoom out again and we expand to the site work, that then we'll be disrupting more of the site, and that would be a whole other conversation. But at the moment, we really don't expect to disturb a whole lot of it.
And then speaking of the site work, are there plans to also expand the archaeological dig? Because I would imagine the log cabin wouldn't be a standalone structure. I would imagine there'd be support
Yeah,
structures such as a barn or,
Yeah, it's a good
other
question.
things.
It's also something that comes up with the State Historic Preservation Office that they will, it's a little unclear whether we're required to go through State Historic Preservation Office review or not, but we at least have to go through the City Historic Review Commission. And in there are some answers that we'll have to provide about, whether we know of any archaeological significance or at least we'll have to prescribe to the builders working on this to how to be careful in the event that they discover something. I'm not sure that we have it in our capacity right now to kind of tackle focused archaeological dig. It's more of like, if they're digging and they turn up something, we're gonna have a prescription for how to handle that situation instead of going out and looking for stuff.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Where was the outhouse?
I don't know. None of us, I mean, we don't know.
What I was going to say was that we can, with the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, I can look into what Carnegie Museum did with the archaeological dig, because I understand from the data we found that it was pretty thorough.
outside
And-
the scope of the actual footprint of the house.
There would have been outbuildings, but the golf course was built. So I'm going to check into especially Falconer's work on founding Shenley Park, but the archaeological things, whatever they found, which was thousands of artifacts, are somewhere in Carnegie Museum. So what I'll do is I'll look into that and put it in our newsletter,
Okay.
what I
That'd be
find out
fascinating
about
to
it.
see.
There's a follow-up. Drew, did you have a question?
Yeah, in the late 80s, early 90s, in conjunction with the Vintage Grand Prix, they had an open house of the log house, and the guy named Dwight Fong gave a tour. I was wondering, is he involved with this? With the
I
group
think
at
he
all?
died, I think,
Oh, okay.
because he also did, if you look at our archives. He did the previous Neill Log House program,
Okay,
which
and-
was, I forget how many years ago, but I do
Okay.
think he's deceased now. I'm not positive, but I think he is.
The best records we have is that there were public programs, educational programs up until the early nineties. We're not sure exactly when.
You know, with something that's so old as this, what the city let it just fall apart, not take care of it, it's just no money and difference.
Okay, there's the justification for a non-public entity like ourselves really advocating for this.
The city fixes potholes. and-
Especially if it has no use. I mean, we're advocating for it, but we have proposed use for it, right? Which sort of justifies. So I think that strengthens the argument for why to invest in it.
Somebody in either the current.
What is his name again? Walt Fong?
Would do a lot.
That's very interesting. I'll follow up on that. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, unless those things were all destroyed when the golf course was built. Like, we really have no idea how much the topography has been manipulated or disturbed.
But we know that it's on its original site.
Mhm.
We're 90% sure that it's on its original site.
More or less.
Well,
There's another log house by the pavilion.
Yeah.
Does that have any historical value?
I'd like Helen to speak to this.
We have looked and looked for any historical records for that house.
The Martin House.
It's completely rebuilt, as I understand it, and the Girl Scouts used to have camps in it. But we only know that it was probably, the land was owned by Ambrose Newton. And he sold, the one parcel went to Robert Neill, the other to Martin. And that's about all we know about it. We're looking.
Again, primary source information, someone who has more skills than I do, who can do some of the hard work and find old tax records. That may lead to more stories, not just about the Neill Log House, but that whole community of log homes up there, because there were. Helen featured that in the June article of the Historical Society. It was one of a number of places that existed. It was the first, but it was by far not the only log house structure for many years in Old Chimney Park, when it was frontier, the wooded frontier 4 miles from the point. Yes.
I should say that there's still hope. I work in the city archives. And we have, tens of thousands of maps and surveys we haven't processed yet. So there's still a lot of hope that we could come across something potentially. So it's very exciting.
can you specifically look for us?
I'm the city archivist, so I'd be happy to look.
That would be fabulous.
This is one of our former presenters also.
Well,
No,
this is, Nick
No.
was Nick is my boss, and he was promoted to records manager, and then I was promoted to city archivist. So,
Okay.
So you're
Because-
next replacement.
yes,
because Nick did a talk for us.
exactly.
And,
Yeah, just before COVID, I believe.
Yeah, if you could work with us, we would love that, because we need original sources. We have secondary sources.
Yes, yeah, I'm in the process of transcribing and digitizing a lot of the old the minute books. As well as
Oh,
going
wow.
through basements. We still have a couple basements full of surveys that we're going through.
So
So
when
I'm
we-
not saying that we're gonna find something, but chances are pretty good. I
When we
think.
get through this next phase of organizing the archives that we required, I think it would be appropriate to share those with you and see what you could add to them.
Yep, yeah, I'd be happy to help in any way
We would
can.
love that.
When you offer us help, you're going to be.
That's fine, man. I want the records to be put to good use. A lot of people don't know we even exist, so.
Well, I'm sure you're already doing this from the little bit that I'm hearing happening within our house, but I think that what strikes me, not being a historian, is I constantly try to think about how can you engage the people who aren't historians into this experience? because history is a fascinating thing. But, you know, there are all of these different kinds of stars. That's me having to make sure that I can check on my older friend that I take care of. So a couple things that come to my mind. One is we talked about usage down the way. And I think that I love the fact that you're really dealing with that now, because I think, to me, really spending time thinking about and brainstorming and creating that space with the understanding that the space will happen, but what are you going to do with it? How will it come alive? In my mind, I like to go at the end and work backwards, because I think that the utility of it is what will get people excited. And you as historians love the building, but you've got to somehow create a space where people want to be there.
If it's not open and accessible to the public, it's, you know, out of sight, out of mind. If it's locked up behind a cyclone fence for 30 years, you don't even think about the stories that you should know and could grow. But there are certainly many, many stories to grow, and we're even talking today at our meeting. If you Google Neill Log House, likely you'll be led right to a wiki site. We're right now respectfully trying to get not a disclaimer, but just a caution posted there saying that there is new information that will shed new light on a lot of what's here. Stay tuned. And we'd like to collaborate with people who are doing work like that to really get more documentation to justify the oral stories that we all hear. There's tons of stuff that's in that training guide that I showed you from Pittsburgh History and Landmark. Most of it is not documented. We would love more oral history, like what came out of our newsletter article last month about people's memories of firsthand experiences growing up in log houses on Chimney Park. So those are the kind, but if that thing is there and it's open, it's going to, as you said, it's going to encourage more people to really explore stories like that.
Well, the other thing, the other point I wanted to make was, you might be taking this for granted, what you're creating in terms of the organization, but how you are pulling together all of these pieces to formulate a project around something, I think could be very interesting from a business school perspective. You know, because a lot of times you're deep in it trying to make it happen, but in fact, you're building the house as you are constructing it. And that could be useful to somehow market.
Well, I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, I have no expertise in any of this. I wrote an article that stimulated some interest, but I don't have one iota of the expertise of Lori or Ellis or Dave or the people who are doing the hard birthday planning work. Okay? We are really blessed to have the kind of talent and the kind of commitment that we have from the board who we've assembled. So I take credit, you know, along with Marty, in being part of that core group who at least thought, we can't do all this, we've got to find people who can. And I think we have.
And the other really fun thing that we have is the Stewart, fourth great grandson of Neill, because that's a story in itself. And just how Charlie found out that he was related to Neill, and the family history that he has is really brings it home to Squirrel Hill. I mean, how lucky are we to have that?
Yes.
Sorry, last thing, and that's speaking to, you know, your descendants there. Has there been any thought about doing an oral history program of the living people that, you know, 100-year-olds that might remember, well, back in the 1930s, we used it for X, because then you get that living memory as opposed to just relying on sources from 200 plus years ago.
Well, you know, like I said, we have a member who, through his own family genealogy, has the living memory of a relative who lived there in the very late 19th century. So that's about as close as we're able to get. Because remember, people didn't live there much beyond 1900.
And I guess
it was a rest stop for the golf course for a number of years.
Well, I guess I just meant just their experience with the log cabin. So not living there, but just gathering the evidence of, what was the log cabin used for between, the creation of the park up to the 1970s. You mentioned it might have been for Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, birthday, I don't know. Picnics.
That's like a
Charlie
missing,
was instrumental, let me just say this, Charlie was instrumental in really, who was the then president of the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks?
Charles Aaronsburg,
Ziegler.
Arthur,
Ziegler. His name
Who
was
we had a
Ziegler.
conversation with.
Arthur Ziegler.
Charlie planned that, so that was a bit of history in itself. To really talk to someone who oversaw the last historic reconstruction. I mean, those are the kind of things we need to do more of. That's probably the last generation that was really, because really, literally, it has been locked up and unused and unthought about for over 30 years, so.
and I was going to say that the missing one, that's one of the missing links in our research is what happened to the log cabin from after the golf course opened to about the 70s when it was redone. We know it was used for a golf rest stop and then a storage shed after that. But that's very sparse knowledge. But I also wanted to say that one of our members, the one who had the reminiscence of his ancestor either living in or near the Neill Log House, he's also working on connecting the intermarriages of families in Peebles, which was what Squirrel Hill was part of this big township called Peebles before, before it was annexed. And he's looking at the relationships between these people and collecting stories. So we're working on that. And it's mainly coming through Turner Cemetery, which dates to 1785, which is not too far from there.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
I won't give you. Please take note of the little message that was on your seat while we closed out the Zoom program.